It suggests that priority is given to some general rules that apply equally to all peoples. If we consider it at the level of the firm or the school, it means, for example, the assigning of persons to positions on the basis of their training and demonstrated capacities, a practice otherwise known as meritocracy. If we consider it at the level of relationships between men and women, and as I reminded people last night in San Jose, now we have relationships between men and women, but that's another matter. If we consider it at the level of relationships, it implies that these should be contracted for reasons of love, as opposed to those of wealth or ethnicity, or any other general particularism. If we consider universalism at the level of the state, at the nation, it refers to rules such as universal suffrage, one man, one vote, and the equal treatment of all before the law. Universalism's mantras are familiar to you all. They are repeated with some regularity in public discourse, even more so by politicians, particularly around election time. But certainly, almost anyone you could talk to would agree that the mantras or the values of universalism are virtuous. The situation is quite the opposite for something like racism. This anti-universalistic value can affect us across all the fields that I just mentioned. Like sexism, for example, most people deny their belief in it and deem it to be what they call an undesirable vice. Correct? So if you walk around today and you ask anybody at random outside on the street in the morning, if they think that one man should have one vote, that people should be treated equally before the law, that if you want to find a girlfriend or boyfriend, it should be done based on love and not ethnicity or wealth, they would all agree with you. If you went outside and said, you think it is right for someone to choose a partner because they are light-skinned or because they have money, they would all tell you that is a vice and that is wrong. But this brings us to one of the many interesting paradoxes or contradictions that we find in the world today. And this is very important, black people. That is the bold and continuous propagation of universalism and the widespread observance of anti-universalism. What I'm saying to you, brothers and sisters, welcome Ms. Waterford and the family. What I'm saying to you, brothers and sisters, is that we have with us, on the one hand, a world that propagates these virtuous values, but on the other hand, a world that observes and practices something totally different. And the reason I start off with this, brothers and sisters, is because we as a people are the ones who most refuse to recognize this reality. And there are many reasons for that, and we're going to get into it as we go along. But one of them is our refusal to acknowledge who we are. First of all, we don't want to have to deal with our identity. And therefore, we can't see the world for what it really is and how it's really organized. Right? So the reality of the world today is that there are rankings of persons into status and identity groups. These social rankings can be crude with two categories, or elaborate with a whole ladder, as in Brazil. And in Brazil, you know, for the last few hundred years, they have categories, over 120 something categories of rankings for people on race. Sometimes I travel in Latin America, and if they ask me if I'm a Cliqueño or something, I never know what they're talking about, but they have many categories. Right? These rankings operate both at the local level and at the level of the world system. And they have enormous consequences in the lives of people and in the operation of the world economy, and are reflected in the contemporary distribution of work, power, and privilege. Everybody follow me then?
Yes.
So we're saying that the world is saying one thing, but it's doing something else. And the reality of what they're doing is in the living that we are experiencing, the lives that we live every day, the reality of what is actually going on. This contradiction has to be justified, right? Because they have to be able to explain why, professing equality, there is such inequality. Professing a desire to reduce poverty, poverty is increasing. They have to explain these contradictions. And the way that they justify these contradictions is two things. One, theories of racial inferiority. Two, the denial of historical truths. Follow me on this. One, theories of racial inferiority. And two, the denial of historical truths. These two strategies allow anti-universalistic norms to be presented not as evils, as which they are, but as codifications of natural or eternal truths or laws that are not just cultural, but biologically rooted. You follow me there? They set up theories of racial inferiority. They deny historical truth to justify the imbalance and inequality that we see all around us. And to make it real, they have to put it in the form of something biological. And we're going to explain that. So let's start off first with the denial of historical truth. One of the most egregious examples of denial of historical truth where African people is concerned is the example of Egypt. And everybody should be familiar with this. In the denial of historical truth in Egypt, there are two things. One is the fact that ancient Egyptians were indeed black Africans.
Yes.
And two, that African peoples are incapable of that level of civilization to which Egypt arrived. Those are the 2 points. Now, to tell you how malicious this thing is, since 1974, at the UNESCO conference, 2 African scholars by the name of Anta Diop, Dr. Anta Diop, and Dr. Theophilo Benga completely destroyed these myths. Yet, up to today, they are still propagating the notion that Egyptians were not black Africans, just like me and you. And I want to read to you what a journalist who was at that conference in 1974 said, just so you can understand how powerful a presentation these two brothers gave. And then I'm going to give you 1 or 2 tidbits of what they said to make their case. One journalist who was present said, although the preparatory working paper sent out by UNESCO gave particulars of what was desired, not all participants had prepared communications comparable with the painstakingly researched contributions of Professor Diop and Professor Obenga. There were consequently a real lack of balance in the discussions. What this person who was there was saying was that you had all these Egyptologists from all over Europe who were so highly respected coming to this conference, and 2 Africans from the continent, the only 2 blacks there, came and completely destroyed them all. So what did Obenga and Diop present to make their case? Let's start with Diop, right? First of all, the argument that the European scholars make today, even today, is that not just Egypt, but all the great civilizations in Africa, coming down to the great Monomotapa, which is in Zimbabwe, were actually the result of the work of dark-skinned Caucasoids, who came into Africa, who migrated into Africa and brought with them great civilization. So when you think of the Maasai, for example, in East Africa, the European scholars would argue that the Maasai are different from you and I. They are really dark-skinned Caucasoids. And they keep this going for the whole of the eastern part of Africa, where you have a lot of our great civilization. And they try to make a distinction between them and the Bantu, which is what they refer to us as, and so on. But let's go back to the argument. So if it is that you have this great race of people who have accomplished great civilization outside of Africa, wouldn't you expect to see some evidence outside of Africa?
Yeah.
Right? When we think of Egypt, we think of the three great pyramids of Khufu, of Khafra, and the other brother, his name slips my mind now. But those three great pyramids are the image we think of. If people came from outside of Africa, shouldn't there be some evidence of pyramid building somewhere else to show that they were doing something before they got there? Well, that's what Shikanta Diop asked. Now, my father answered that question for me as a child. He used to conduct tours to Egypt, and he went south into the Sudan and Ethiopia, and there he found hundreds of pyramids, starting off from about this tall and going all the way up into the sky. They build them tall, they build them short, they build them fat. Some of them fall down to the side because they were practicing in Africa, further south in Africa, before they got it right. And when they got it right, then they put it on the Giza Plateau. Diop pointed out that the Egyptians themselves tell us about where they come from. Why do we have to ask anybody else? It's right there. They wrote. They had writing. They had books. It's there on the walls of the temples in stone. The Egyptians say, we come from the foothills of the mountains of the moon. That is Mount Kilimanjaro. That is the beginning of the Nile. That is in Uganda. The Egyptians say that about themselves. Right? But Diop went further. He developed something called the melanin test. And I'm sure Brother Barton, and we can call him doctor in his old age, I'm sure he knows about that test. Diop was able to take a skin, a piece of skin, no bigger than this, from a mummy, put it in a solution, and then illuminate it with that neon black, what they call black light. Mm-hmm. That would then be able, they would then be able to, the particles of melanin in the skin, which is what gives you and I our complexion, would then be visible. And you could then count them. And by counting the particles of melanin, you would know for a fact what was the nature of the race of the person, even if they were dead more than 1,000 years ago. And so Diop did this test on a couple of the mummies that they allowed him to do it on, but they wouldn't allow him to do it on others. So Diop had about 11 different ones, but those are just two. I just want to mention those two. Let me move on to Theophile Obenga. Brother Obenga was a linguist, and he asked the question, how does Europe trace its history to Greece? And the answer was through language, right? The so-called Romantic languages have Greek origin, and so the Europeans consider themselves the inheritors of the knowledge and wisdom of the Greeks. So he says, if Egypt was a child of the Middle East or the Caucasus, shouldn't there be some linguistic predecessor to the language of Kemet somewhere in that region? And they searched and they searched and they searched. Up to the day, those European scholars are still searching and they can't find it. Theophile Obenga, on the other hand, just said, okay, let me look around in Africa. What do you think he found? He found that almost every language on the continent of Africa is related to the ancient language of Kemet, of ancient Egypt. And he found something else that is even more interesting to you and me in particular. He found that the language today that most closely resembles the ancient language of Egypt is the Wolof language. Can anybody in here tell me where, except for Miss Bura, since she was here last night, but can anybody in here tell me where the Wolof language is from? The Wolof language is from the Senegambia region, most popular in Senegal, on the western coast of Africa, where most of our ancestors come from. So you see the relationship? Let's give a round of applause for this group. Appreciate